Giannis trade and free agency rumors have been a thing for over 7 years now, from when he really established himself as a rising superstar in the league in the 2016-17 season, all the way up to this disaster of a season that the Bucks are having right now. Giannis as the next big superstar to be moved has been on our minds the entire time. But it hasn't happened. And when you talk about something for that long, as I have on this channel, and it still doesn't happen, you start to believe that it never will. But right now, the possibility of Giannis playing for a team that is not the Milwaukee Bucks soon is as real as it has ever been. And when it comes to Giannis movement, there are 3 categories to separate things into. In-season trades, a trade that could happen this season. Off-season trades that could happen in the 2025 offseason, and then free agency, which is a couple years away. Let's first talk about in-season trades. If we're looking at rumors, looking at teams that might be in on the Giannis sweepstakes, the Miami Heat have been involved the entire time. Going back to when he signed his extension prior to the 2021 season, when they won the title, they traded for Drew Holiday. Even going back to then, Miami has been a rumored destination for him, whether it be in free agency or via trade. And we know that Miami has been active in trying to get a star down there in Miami, even going back to last offseason when they tried to get Damian Lillard before Milwaukee ultimately traded for him. So it makes sense that the Heat would be involved here as a possible Giannis destination. And in terms of an in-season trade, it's basically impossible. If the Bucks were to trade Giannis, the entire concept of the move would be to tear things down, get young players, get assets, get things that help them moving forward into the future. And the structure of a Giannis to the Heat trade right now would not do that for them. Basically, the assets would be Bam, Tyler Hero, maybe Jimmy Butler is somehow involved, and then a bunch of draft picks. They have some other young guys, whether it be Jaime Jaquez, which I don't think Miami would want to trade. They have Jovic, who's kind of interesting, I guess. And then a couple of other role guys, like maybe Terry Rozier, but they just don't have the young player kind of assets that typically are required in a trade of this magnitude. Now, the counter to that would be maybe you could send Bam or Hero or Butler, whatever they would want the construction of the trade to be. Maybe you could send one of those guys to another team that would then reroute draft picks or young players to Milwaukee. That's certainly a possibility. But in the second apron era where we're dealing with all these teams that have so much money on the payroll and it's so restricted to try and trade with, it's going to be harder to put together 3-team deals. And this brings me to a point that is going to overshadow all of the Giannis trade discussions. And that is, they don't have control of any of their draft picks until 2030. And the teams that control those picks are not teams that would be Giannis destination. So the concept of tearing everything down makes sense, but if they can't get back some of the picks they traded for Dame from Portland or some of the picks that New Orleans still owes them, it makes it that much more difficult for them to really commit to a Giannis trade, no matter how potentially unhappy he may be. But first, more Isaiah Stewart points, more Dennis Schroeder points, more Nikola Jokic points. That is my selection on the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. And on top of that, today is Friday. Every Friday, Prize Picks offers a protected play to each of their members. You either win your selection or you get your cash back. So you can use that selection, and even if it's wrong, you get to run it back a different day. And that is just one of the many offerings Prize Picks is rolling out. They're also starting live squares, so you can actually make some of these selections mid-game. You just got to look for the little red light flashing on the screen. And as always, new users get $50 instantly when they place their first $5 lineup when they use code SPORTING. So right now, you can use that selection, go get your $50 instantly when you play your $5 lineup and you use code SPORTING, and it's Flex Friday, so you win or you get your cash back. So all you got to do is go on Prize Picks, scroll through, figure out which selection you want, whether it's mine or you can make your own. There's so many options: points, assists, rebounds, points, assists. You can combine it with other sports as well if you want to be watching football at the same time you're watching NBA stuff. You put all that together and you're having a super fun time on Prize Picks. Again, use the link in the description, use code SPORTING for $50 instantly when you place your first $5 lineup, and then you get a Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. The next big in-season trade team, which is actually kind of possible, is the Golden State Warriors. They've gotten off to a great start this season. They have a ton of role players. They have a ton of guys that make sense around Steph. And in contrast to Miami, they actually have some future guys that the Bucks would want, namely Jonathan Kuminga. They have a couple of other draft picks as well. And basically anybody on the roster other than Steph, obviously, and then Draymond, mostly because Milwaukee just wouldn't want him, would be available for trade. The thing that complicates this is something that I talked about in the previous section with Miami. The second apron, the tax, all that stuff together basically means that in this scenario, Milwaukee would have to get back the exact amount of salary that they trade out. And they can't send out more than just Giannis to aggregate that salary, essentially meaning it's very difficult to salary match. But if you just temporarily ignore that for a second, the concept of a trade would look something like Jonathan Kuminga, Brandon Podziemski, whatever picks Golden State wants to trade, and then some salary filler. In this case, it's Andrew Wiggins and Gary Payton. Maybe that can get rerouted to a third team, whatever the case may be. That still, by the way, does not feel like a lot. It still doesn't feel like a Giannis level trade package. But that's another issue with this, is a lot of the teams that would be trading for Giannis, Miami, Golden State, they don't have necessarily the amount of assets you would typically expect in a Giannis trade, and Milwaukee's not necessarily in a hurry to make this move, so unless you absolutely blow them away with an offer, it's going to be tough. Which brings me to a team that absolutely has the assets to make this work, and that is the Houston Rockets. They have all these young guys. They have a ton of picks. They have picks from other teams as well. They wouldn't even have to use their own picks necessarily. A ton of young guys that Milwaukee would be interested in, and they could start to build a really solid young core there in Milwaukee through a Giannis trade, which would obviously be the goal. But there's two main issues here with Giannis ending up in Houston. One, is this a team that has proven enough? Are they good enough for Giannis to say, hey, if I go there, I want to win titles? Because that's the entire motivation of him leaving Milwaukee. It's not, I just want to leave the Bucks because I want to leave the Bucks. He wants to go somewhere where he has a chance to win titles. And depending on what they do or don't trade out, whatever's left, is there enough real championship level players there left in Houston to prevent Giannis from just being in the exact same situation that he is in Milwaukee? But more importantly, two of the main pieces that would probably, or at least one of, would be involved in the Giannis trade would be Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green, neither of which can get traded in season because they just signed extensions. Those guys cannot be traded until the offseason. So as an in-season trade team, unless Houston somehow figures out a way to not involve either Sengun or Green in the deal, it seems very unlikely, which brings us to the offseason stuff. All of the stuff that I've already talked about with the Heat and the Warriors still applies, although obviously you have another year of evaluation of whether it be Tyler Hero or Kuminga, or maybe those guys aren't on the teams anymore. All that stuff still applies. But more interestingly, the Rockets become a real possibility in the 2025 offseason. Depending on how their season goes, they have so many different options here. You can see some of the salary matching, whether it be Dylan Brooks, Steven Adams, you can put Ben Thompson in there, you can do Alperen Sengun, you can do first-round picks from other teams. If Houston really, really wants Giannis and Milwaukee's willing to trade him, they absolutely have more than enough stuff to be able to trade away. It depends on what they would like to trade away, what they would prefer to trade away, but they definitely can get close. Not to mention the fact that at that point, they'd have the option to decline Fred VanVleet's team option, which would make salary matching much easier and makes them, in my opinion, of all the teams in the league that could realistically trade for Giannis, the most likely offseason trade team to try and get Giannis in the 2025 offseason. Another team that I feel like I have to mention here is the Oklahoma City Thunder. In season, it makes no sense for them. They're probably going to be the 1 seed in the West. They're going to be one of the favorites to win the title. I don't think you mess that up by trading guys away to get Giannis in the middle of the year. In the offseason, you might think this is a real possibility. They have all these picks, they have all these young guys, but here's the problem. OKC is already really good, and to me, you're obviously not trading SGA. I don't think they're trading either Jalen Williams or Chet Holmgren in exchange for Giannis. They want to add Giannis to that core of 3 guys, and they certainly have a ton of other assets, picks, young guys, all these different players they could trade in exchange for Giannis. But in terms of a focal point player in a trade, there are other teams that can offer more, whether it be Sengun, whether it be Jalen Green, and I don't think OKC is going to move either of those guys, nor honestly should they. Giannis is incredible, but they've put together a team that not only fits incredibly well together, but if you add Giannis to those 3 guys, Chet's like the perfect big to play alongside Giannis. They've got all this other playmaking as well that works really well around him, all this spacing, all the shooting. It's a perfect team for him to show up to. I just don't know if he would jump to another smaller market team away from Milwaukee. It almost kind of feels like when KD went to the Warriors, where it's like, okay, you're not really making your own path. You're just joining a team that's already ready-made for you to win a title, which obviously is his goal, but I actually don't think OKC is all that realistic of an option unless they're willing to just trade every single draft pick that they have and Giannis actually wants to go there. The other team that I would look at here would be the Brooklyn Nets, a team that has reportedly been involved potentially on some Giannis stuff, whether it be in the past or moving forward into the future. And it's difficult to project exactly what that would look like for them because we have no idea what the team is going to look like in the 2025 offseason. Right now, they have a decent start to the year. They've got a ton of veterans. They've got Dennis Schroeder. They've got Nick Claxton. They've got Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith. They have a decent NBA team, Cam Thomas, right? But the assumption is that they're going to trade some of those guys and have a top 7 pick in the draft. And so at that point, do you use that pick to try and trade for Giannis? If it's the first pick in the draft, is someone like Cooper Flagg or Ace Bailey or somebody else good enough as a partner to pair alongside Giannis to convince him to actually want to come to Brooklyn? And again, who is left on the team? What other pieces are you using in terms of matching salary? And in terms of a trade possibility, to me, it seems pretty unlikely that Brooklyn would actually be able to make this happen as soon as the 2025 offseason because the team just isn't good enough. They don't have that other star, and currently they don't really have the ability to. Yes, they'd have some cap space in 2025. They'd have some options in 2026, 2027 as well. But in terms of when Giannis shows up to the team, I'm not sure how they put a super competitive team around him. Obviously, if he says he wants to go there, they're going to try and make it work. But when you add in the possible draft stuff, they feel like a team that would potentially be more in on this in 2026 or 2027, which brings me to arguably the most important part of all this. Giannis Antetokounmpo has a player option in the summer of 2027. Prior to that, he is a member of the Milwaukee Bucks until they trade him. He cannot leave. He cannot force his way out. He cannot tell them, hey, I'd like to go to this team or that team. They have to be the ones to trade him. If he was a 2025 free agent or a 2026 free agent, this process would be much more accelerated, but he doesn't have that kind of leverage, and I truly don't think that he wants to leave. That has been the constant in the entirety of the time we've been doing the Giannis rumors. He doesn't want to leave the Bucks. He wants to stay there, but he wants to win titles more than he wants to just stay in Milwaukee for no reason. But because of the fact that the Bucks don't own any of the future first-round picks, they really don't want to trade him either, regardless of how unhappy he gets. So prior to the 2027 offseason, which is the point at which Giannis could just leave and go somewhere else, prior to that, I don't think the Nets are super involved. I don't think the Heat are super involved given the asset issues there in Miami and just the general uncertainty there with the Nets. And so unless it's the Rockets this year or the Rockets in the offseason, maybe the Warriors this year or in the offseason, it would take a disaster of a season for the Bucks to actually lose Giannis Antetokounmpo, which, by the way, they're pretty close to. Their inability to put a competitive team around him post-Drew Holiday trade is the thing that has accelerated all of this. And there is absolutely a possibility that at some point this year before the trade deadline or in the 2025 offseason, they are basically forced to make this move because they have just done such a bad job of team building around one of the best players in the entire league.